Black Mirror works so well for thinking about the unintended consequences of technology is that it takes a current technology and pushes it just a step further to show the things that could happen in a worst case scenario. And we're also going to talk a little bit later about why teaching ethics and teaching about unintended consequences in particular is very important. But first, let me talk a little bit about these 4 specific episodes. So the first one, Entire History of You. Imagine, or go back in time a few years ago to when Google Glass launched. For those of you who remember this, it felt a little bit like a flash in the pan. It didn't go particularly well, and it wasn't around for very long. And one of the reasons was that our social norms were just not set up for this kind of technology, which was basically the ability for someone to record the world around them all the time, and in particular without people knowing about it. But Google Glass wasn't even the beginning of this idea of life logging or recording everything around you or keeping track of everything that's happening in your life. The military had a project about this quite some time ago, and there were also very early life loggers on the internet. And also for those of you who have seen the movie The Circle or read the book, that also is taking this technology a bit further. And in The Entire History of You, you see the unintended social consequences of what happens if you really had a record of literally everything in your life. And in particular in this show, for example, it shows what would happen to a married couple who were fighting about something like, well, let's rewind the tape and see who's right. But of course it gets a lot darker than that. And I think that this episode is a really great example of how broader social consequences have to be taken into account with any emerging technology. You can't just think about how it's going to impact an individual or what it's intended to do, but these larger, hugely changing social consequences. And this definitely happens with any technology that becomes so deeply embedded in the fabric of society that it's impacting everything. Facebook, I think, is a great example of that right now.
Yeah.
So the next episode is from season 2, and it's called Be Right Back.
Yeah, well, you aren't you, are you?
That's another difficult one, to be honest with you.
You're just a few ripples of you. There's no history to you. You're just a performance of stuff that he performed without thinking, and it's not enough.
Come on. I aim to please.
Aim to jump. Just do it.
Okay. If you're absolutely sure.
This episode I actually use in a more complicated teaching exercise that I'll talk about in a minute. And it's based on the idea that someone could keep living after they're dead by way of their communication patterns. And in the episode, this starts off in a slippery slope kind of way. Just a chatbot to start. And then, of course, by the end of the episode, we have this entirely realistic, looks exactly like a person robot. Now, we're very, very far from that kind of technology, I think. But the first stage of the technology that's presented in the episode is actually right around the corner, if not already here. So there has been a lot of research around post-mortem data, digital immortality. Some of this is happening in our very own department here at CU Boulder with my colleague Jed Brubaker. And he's actually the one who told me about a startup from a number of years ago where their tagline was, "When your heart stops beating, you'll keep tweeting." It doesn't actually seem to be around anymore.
Oh, God. That's terrifying.
Oh, awkward.
But this idea that someone's communication patterns could be analyzed and, you know, an AI could spit out a replica of how that person communicates is certainly not outside the realm of possibility, even if the technology certainly wouldn't be as good as it is in this episode. And, you know, by the time we get to a completely realistic robot of a dead person that is integrating themselves back into a grieving person's life, it goes about as well as you would expect. This is one of those things. This is one of those things that seems like such a good idea. We're going to help people who are grieving without taking into account the complexity of that process and the other down the road ramifications of what would happen. When I show this episode in class, I actually use it as a way to talk about future regulation. Because imagine a world in which there are completely realistic robots that come from a person who was previously alive. I use this as an example to show how it's hard to regulate things before you know what's going to happen. Often for technology, because it moves so fast, our regulation is slow to keep up and it tends to be reactionary. Like something weird happens and then, oh no, we have to do something about that, right? So the first time that a robot murders someone, there's going to be a new law, right? And what happens around things like property ownership and child custody and copyright and liability, and what happens if you decide you don't want the robot anymore? What happens to it? So these are all kinds of interesting questions, and when I use this in class, we essentially go through these scenarios and come up with a set of regulations that we change as we go along. And then I compare that to technology of the past that really change things in a similar way. I mean, even something like the VCR, or, you know, certainly the very early days of the internet, when it was impossible to know how to regulate that. So this is a really good example of that as well. So the next episode is from season 3, I believe, Nosedive.
No, step away, ma'am.
God, just fucking help me!
I've called security.
Oh, no, please don't do that. I'm a 5-starring you. 5 stars?
What's the issue here, Hannah?
Intimidation and profanity.
Oh, no, I was not intimidating.
Don't speak, ma'am.
I was just trying to...
Okay, so, in order to restore calm, I'm invoking my authority as airport security to dock you 1 full ranking point as a punitive measure. This is a temporary measure.
No!
The score reverts to normal in 24 hours.
No, but I need it now.
Period. All down votes are subject to a ×2 multiplier.
×2?
We recommend you avoid negative feedback at this time.
I'm on double damage.
Please, remove yourself from the airport immediately.
I would say that this is actually the favorite episode of undergraduate students when I talk about it. I think because we're so deeply embedded with social media that this idea that, you know, whether you're getting Instagram likes could change your life resonates very strongly with young people. So in this episode, The protagonist is trying to raise essentially a sort of social credit score. The app looks a bit like Instagram. She's taking photos and then really hoping that she gets 5 stars on everyone because her overall score will go up or down. And it's impacting things in her life, like whether she can get a discount on a really fancy apartment that she wants, because people who are influencers have more credit in society. This might be taken to a very literal sense in this episode, but the overall statement there is actually quite true. Particularly when you compare this to the current social credit system in China, which is also something that's happening right now, that I suspect was an inspiration for this episode. And there are stories there where your social credit score can impact things like air travel or where you can live, etc. Now, of course, it's not based on Instagram likes. So it's this very interesting idea to combine these two things that are currently happening. Social media anxiety around presenting yourself as, you know, the ideal person so that you can get likes. And then this idea that something about your, you know, a personal score for you can be impacting things in your life. And of course, in this episode, things just go downhill very, very quickly and dramatically. Mm-hmm. So this episode also works really well for talking through things that you know, I think that a lot of students are really thinking about, this like social media anxiety. It's also a great example of when something that, you know, was probably created by a tech company suddenly has huge social ramifications, both at a society level and an individual level. And the last episode is Archangel.
Hey, lady! Sarah! I found her!
Oh, God, I'm so sorry.
Sarah will be part of our trial period.
Response so far is just incredible. A sense of security, peace of mind. The stories we've been hearing, they are truly inspirational.
It's completely safe.
Sure it is, honey.
Again, a parent is concerned about their child's safety, and there's a new technology where you implant something into the child where then the parent has a tablet and they can see the child's vitals, they get notifications if their heart rate goes up or if they take a narcotic or if they're pregnant, but also they can see a feed of what that child is seeing. And when it's, you know, and when it's a very young child, when there's this 5-year-old in this episode, it seems super useful. Like they're able to, you know, find her if she gets lost and make sure that she, you know, isn't in danger. There's also basically a parental control of filter that happens in the child's brain so that if something upsets her, it sort of fuzzies it out, which then has these, you know, unintended consequences of sort of desensitizing this child so that, you know, if they see, you know, things that are upsetting, they don't actually upset them, which can be bad. But then the real, you know, the real lesson here then comes when the child is a teenager, which is something that, you know, we're having a lot of conversations about right now. Spying on teenagers, you know, apps that parents can get so that they can read all of their kids' texts. So again, it's taking something that's happening right now, like, should I read my child's texts to make sure that they're not doing drugs or, you know, doing things that would get them in trouble, or to make sure that they're not, you know, meeting predators online or whatever. Taking that and then thinking, what is the next step of this technology? You know, it's plausible. What if you could actually see through the child's eyes? Like, that is, you know, a logical next step of this technology. And you might be thinking that it seems ludicrous, but there's lots of things that are, you know, happening right now that 10 years ago would have seemed completely ludicrous.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's another example of taking something, pushing it a little forward, and then thinking, what could happen? What would be the bad things that might happen if this technology existed? And if you rewind 10 years and think about the beginning of the very early stages of technology that we have now, that are currently causing problems, Facebook, facial recognition, predictive policing, pick your favorite current ethical dilemma. If you thought about it 10 years ago, could you have imagined what that might be today and what problems it would be causing? So this is the lesson that I think is so important for teaching ethics, particularly to technologists. The way that I think about this when I, if we talk about Black Mirror in a class, so we spend a whole class period talking about like the ethical future of robots that look exactly like dead people, and people get really excited about it, like, oh, this thing would happen and this thing would happen, and here's how you'd have to design things. In the last class I taught, the students came up with like a very specific idea for how the robots would need to have like markers so that it was clear that they were robots for all of these reasons, and that would impact the design. If you can get so excited about thinking through the ethical implications of some technology that someone might create in like 100 years, then you should be able to do the exact same thing with the technology that you are going to create next week. So I'm trying to think through teaching ethical speculation about technology as a skill. Can we figure out how to get people to do this when they're actually designing technology in the real world? Groups of product teams who are saying not just how are people going to use this as we intend them to, but how might they be misused? My favorite example of this recently is Zoom bombing. So if you're unaware, Zoom bombing is something that we hope will not happen right now. When an unwanted person crashes a public Zoom meeting, for the purposes of trolling. And this is something that has happened even in university classes. People will screen share pornography or come in and yell racial slurs. It's really awful. And it's something that design could have prevented, and there have been some changes or some suggestions in the interface to make it harder to do this. But the CEO of Zoom did an interview with the New York Times and said, yeah, we never thought about this. Like, it didn't occur to us that people might use the technology in this way.
Our service was built to serve business and a lot of enterprise customers. However, during this COVID-19 crisis, we moved too fast. Our intention to serve the end users, serve the K-12 schools. However, we had some missteps. We should have done something to enforce password and waiting room and double check every server settings. But over the past 1 week and 2 weeks, we already took actions to fix those missteps. Because the new user case is very different to our traditional business and enterprise customers where they have IT team to support.
And I feel like sitting in a room and saying, here are our user personas. Trolls, abusive ex-partners, whatever it is, like, sexual predators. How would these people use our technology? And then how can we change the design so that they cannot do those things?
Right.
So this is something that I think we can learn from thinking about science fiction.